Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. Today, I have the pleasure and the honor of receiving Dr. Ned Markosian, distinguished contemporary philosopher and professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And today, we are going to be talking about metaphysics. So, welcome to the channel, Dr. Markosian. Thanks a lot for being here. I would like
Thank you.
to
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I appreciate it.
thank you. So I would like to start with a question on your view on metaphysics. Many people today who are not analytic philosophers, when they hear the word metaphysics, they think it is something outdated that has been left behind in contemporary philosophy, especially in Brazilian academia, who happens to have a very strong Marxist and post structuralist influence. So, with that in mind, what is your view on metaphysics? And is the scientific project even possible without metaphysics presuppositions?
Yeah, great question. The short answer, I think, is no. So I think there are metaphysical presuppositions in a lot of disciplines, including pretty much all of the sciences, what we think of as the natural sciences. Um, and not just metaphysical presuppositions, like theoretical physicists, for example, are doing metaphysics. So like when they come up with theories, um, there's very often some metaphysical content built into the theory. And I think that's like fine, but also unavoidable. So it's a good thing it's fine. Um, yeah. So one thing that does come up sometimes is people will talk about what they claim is an empirical theory, like this is just from science, we have to accept it, we can't question it, and it has some metaphysical consequences, like for example about the nature of time. um, and I think sometimes a mistake is made where they overlook the metaphysical assumptions that are built into the theory,
Mhm.
and so there actually is a way to resist the conclusion they're arguing for by going for um, an empirically equivalent version of the theory, like maybe it's special relativity,
Mhm.
and an empirically equivalent version that doesn't have the same metaphysical baggage built into it. But anyway, in general, I think that metaphysics is alive and well and inevitable. But by the way, one last thing on that, like that's not to say that there's anything wrong with people ignoring metaphysics. You can ignore it, that's fine. Maybe you're interested in questions about political philosophy and philosophy of economics, and it might make sense, therefore, to ignore metaphysical questions about like the fundamental nature of reality.
Mhm. So, in your view, what is metaphysics, broadly speaking?
Yeah, it's actually like famously tricky to give a definition of metaphysics, and I think metaphysicians have a harder time than non-metaphysicians within philosophy giving a definition of metaphysics. Um, so, like historically, the term came from some work that was published of Aristotle's, like after a work that was called Physics. And so the title in Greek was Metaphysics, which just meant what we published after we published that other one called the Physics. Um, and actually, both of those works contained a lot of the same discussions of the same topics, like about existence and causation and time and identity and possibility, etc. So anyway, those topics came to be associated with the term metaphysics, but that seems a little bit like random and accidental. And it does, I think a lot of us feel like there's more to the topics discussed in metaphysics, like they do have something in common. Sometimes people say it's about the fundamental nature of reality, but I think people in aesthetics are also interested in the fundamental nature of reality. It's just that some of them think that aesthetic properties are part of the fundamental nature of reality. People in biology are interested in the fundamental nature of reality, physics, chemistry. So maybe that's not the most informative. Um, I think one thing we could say that might be helpful is if you have a sense of what philosophy is, a big if perhaps, but if you have a sense of what philosophy is, and then like you probably understand ethics as a core area of philosophy that has to do with moral topics, and you probably can understand epistemology as a core area of philosophy that has to do with knowledge and justification. And then you can think of metaphysics as everything else in the core area of philosophy that's not ethics or epistemology.
Uh-huh.
So it's more about like the fundamental nature of reality, independently of what's right and wrong and independently of what we could know.
Right. Okay. So, classic metaphysics, anchored in Aristotelian thought, seem to be very reliant on teleology. Teleology appears to have been in a way abandoned in modern thought. Why do you think that is, and what are your views on teleology?
Yeah. I don't really know the answer to the why question. I think a lot of these things are just like contingent historical happenstance. Um, but I do suppose that a sort of like uh, philosophy founded in like theology and religious thought played a big part for many years,
Uh-huh.
and in the history of philosophy, like through even through modern philosophy, like 18th century um, philosophy, but then came not to play such a big part. And so I think when when it was more secular, when philosophy became more secular for the most part, that might have coincided with a decrease in focus on teleology. Um, but I think, I'm not really the right one to ask about that. Like a historian of recent philosophy would probably be able to answer that question.
Right.
I just know that like when I was coming up, um, teleology was like one of the last things I ever heard about in philosophy. So like, I didn't go to religious schools in my upbringing, and then the college in the U.S. that I went to had no religious affiliation, and the particular philosophy department, this was Oberlin College, it's in Ohio, um, didn't there wasn't a big focus on religious philosophy or teleology for that matter. Same thing with graduate school. So when I first heard about teleology, it was pretty late in my development as a philosopher.
It does not play a role in your ideas.
I think that's probably true. Yeah.
Okay. Uh, Maybe it has to do with it being difficult to prove. It's something that uh, evolutionary biology, uh, Newtonian physics have made it without. I think maybe this has led modern philosophers to disconcern teleology.
Mhm.
On the other hand, we still have here in Brazil a strong branch of Aristotelian Thomist thinkers, uh, usually associated with political conservatism
Mm.
and people who will will sometimes offer, for example, courses on Thomist psychology and a philosophical graduation anchored in the Thomist tradition, which is something people like myself have a hard time understanding because it seems to be sort of ideologically inspired. I wonder what you think of this contemporary Thomist tradition and if you see any similar thing happening in the US.
Uh, yeah, I guess again, I'm probably not the best person to ask about this. I would say I don't see a similar thing happening in the US. There are plenty of philosophers in the US who are theists,
Yeah.
but also plenty who are not. Um, and for those of us who are not theists, we're just not really focused on questions about Thomism and God and sort of that tradition. But I do feel like the uh, like philosophy of religion and theistic philosophy is still a strong movement within the US and maybe the Anglo world in general. Um, yeah, but I'm not sure about a connection between that and like right wing ideology.
Yeah,
I
right.
just don't know.
Yeah, it's curious because here in Brazil, it does seem to be a tendency, uh,
Mhm,
whereas people who are interested in Thomist and religious philosophy are not going to be so interested in contemporary religious philosophy or religion like Alvin Plantinga and stuff.
mhm.
Rather, they go back and say, "Oh, modern thought is worthless. Descartes ruined it all. Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas had everything under control." And then there's, yeah, there's this strong ideological sense
Uh-huh,
in many people. This is not when you came here. This is not the case. Uh, I think this is not the case with the people you met, but
uh-huh,
it is a thing here.
uh-huh.
Um, but as we are speaking about philosophy of religion, I wonder what your views are. I'm guessing you are an atheist, and I'd like
That's
to
right.
know why.
Why?
Yeah, philosophically.
Uh, Philosophically, because of, I guess, a combination of two things. One is that like to believe a positive existence claim, like a claim that says a thing of this particular description exists, I would need uh, positive evidence, which could be in the form of an a priori argument. So, like, it could be the ontological argument. But I happen not to be convinced by any of the arguments that have been proposed for the existence of God. So, for me, the default position then is not to believe. So that's the first reason. And then the second reason is the problem of evil. So, when I think about the problem of evil, it seems to me that an omniscient God would have to know about the evil in the world. Um, an omnipotent God would be able to do something about it, and an omnibenevolent God would care and so be motivated to do something. So it seems like there's a lot of evil in the world, and that's not consistent with an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent God. So that's like a not just a lack of an argument for, but an argument against theism. So that's what is convincing to me.
What do you think about the theistic response to that when they go to free will?
Uh-huh.
You are familiar with this, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that that could explain some of the evil in the world, evil that's caused by creatures with free will.
Hmm.
But I think that not all of the evil in the world can be accounted for just by thinking about creatures with free will. So, I think there have been plenty of cases of like natural disasters, um, or like cancer and other kinds of illness, that don't happen because somebody with free will made a particular decision. Yeah.
Okay, so being an atheist metaphysician is something of a challenge in a way because do you believe there is an ontological structure to reality, like beyond the physical? with would include abstract properties, maybe universals.
I do believe that. Yes.
Okay, would you mind just elaborating a little bit? Because many people in the audience, they think it's black and white, or either you believe God or or else there's no transcendence and it's all just physicalism and materialism.
Uh-huh. So let's take, I guess you said something about abstract objects, like let's take numbers as an example.
Yeah.
So I think that um, a theist should say that God did not create numbers. They exist automatically, necessarily. And I think a theist should also say that, like, it's not up to God to make it true that 2 + 2 = 4 and other mathematical truths. Those, again, are just automatic. These are things that are necessarily true. And then what God gets to do is figure out what world will exist, what will be actual, that's consistent with whatever is necessarily true. Um, and I think a theist should not think that that's any kind of shortcoming or lack of power on God's part. Um, God's power should be like the power to do anything that's logically possible.
Yeah.
Um, but 2 + 2 being equal to 5 is not logically possible. So God's not obliged to be able to bring that about. Anyway, if that's all correct, then I think if you don't believe in God, you have all the same reasons for believing in these necessary truths, like about mathematics and about the numbers. Um, and so I think the same reasons, which are metaphysical arguments for numbers, propositions, universals, etc., would still be good reasons.
Hmm. And this require the universe to be eternal in a way or not?
Uh, yeah, good question. I think maybe not. So something would be eternal. Like imagine that for eternity, for an infinite amount of time, there was no physical objects, no physical universe, but there was still space and time. And then some matter just popped into existence. I mean, it's kind of like the story they tell us about the Big Bang.
Yeah.
Um, so that seems consistent. Um, and then maybe the matter exists for whatever amount of time, but then it all eventually gets annihilated and we're back to nothing in space and time for eternity. So the universe itself wouldn't be eternal, it would be finite in this scenario that I just described. Um, but there would still be like any an infinite stretch of time in which the history of the universe plays out. And in that infinite stretch of time, there would be numbers and propositions and universals, etc. So abstract things.
Yeah, but I found it interesting that you included space and time in
Uh-huh.
those, because you could argue that space and time they are part of the the this other universe of physical things, right? So,
Yeah.
but you think that space and time are also categories of this ontological layer.
That's what I think. I mean, not every contemporary metaphysician agrees with me about this, but yeah, I think of space and time like I have a substantivalist view of space and time. So they're there automatically, and then there might be something in space and time or not. That's a contingent matter.
Right. And they are weird. Why are they there?
Space and time?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah. I mean, I don't have a worked out argument for this, but I want to believe that space like is necessary. Um, and I'm actually kind of open to uh, different numbers of dimensions of space. So like maybe string theory is correct, and maybe there are 11 dimensions of space, and for some reason we're only able to understand or think about 3 of the dimensions of space. But anyway, I think there has to be physical space. And then I think any object located in physical space, that's a physical object.
Right.
In fact, that's how I think we should understand the distinction between physical objects and non-physical objects. The physical ones are the ones that have locations in physical space. I also think, though, time is completely different. So it's popular to think of space-time
Yeah.
as a unified manifold. I think you might have heard me talk about this a little bit when I was in Brazil. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, I've seen a paper by you also that is called the truth about the past, the future, the
Oh
present.
yeah. There's also a more recent paper called 5 New Arguments for the Dynamic Theory of Time. And in that paper, I give some arguments against the popular idea that space and time form a unified manifold,
Wow.
where like you can think of like the spatial dimensions as at right angles to one another. But then the popular view is that time is also a dimension that's at right angles to each of the 3 spatial dimensions. And then time plus the 3 spatial dimensions form space-time, which is a unified manifold, which means something, although people don't often say exactly what that means. Um, and then I try to say what it would mean for space-time to be a unified manifold, and then I give some arguments for the conclusion that space-time is not a manifold.
Hmm.
So like if you think of the 3 dimensions of physical space, that's kind of like a paradigm example of a unified manifold. So the dimensions really are connected, and any object that has a location along one of those dimensions must also have a location along each of the other dimensions. It doesn't have to be extended, it could be a point. But if it has a location along the like side to side dimension, then it also has a location along the up down dimension and the front back. Um, and I think that if you add time to the 3 spatial dimensions, the result is not a unified manifold in that sense. So objects can have a location in time without having a location along any of the spatial dimensions. So like numbers are like that.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
also think another one of my arguments is that if some dimensions form a unified manifold, like physical space again, then if you have an object in that n-dimensional space, like a pen in physical space, and if you rotate it in the space, that does not change the intrinsic features of the object. So rotating the pen in physical space doesn't change the intrinsic features. But I think if you add time to the dimensions of space to have a 4-dimensional manifold, and then you put objects in that space and rotate them, that does change their intrinsic features. So I give examples like sideways music. So if you have a series of events, like the notes of a beautiful piece of music being played, being performed um, in space-time, like over time, but then you rotate that series of events in the 4-dimensional space so that all the notes are happening at once, but spread out a little bit in space. I think that changes the aesthetic value of the event. It goes from being beautiful music to being a cacophony of sound where all the notes are happening at once, and that's not aesthetically beautiful.
Ah, cool. So this ties with your philosophy of art that we saw it here, which was great. Um,
Yeah, so that argument presupposed like realism about aesthetic value.
yeah, this is interesting because I was going to ask you about other properties besides mathematical numbers,
Yeah.
like you said aesthetic properties are real. What
Yeah.
about moral properties? Are you a moral
Yeah.
realist?
I'm very much a moral realist. And I think a similar kind of case makes the same point about space-time. So, for example, if you have a series of events that goes from an unjust situation to a just resolution,
Mhm.
that has a certain moral value. But if you reverse it, so it goes from just to unjust,
Right.
that has lower intrinsic value because of the moral realism.
Yeah. And inside moral realism, uh, in a meta-ethics point of view, would you consider yourself a naturalist or an intuitionist
Ah,
or something else for the matter?
yeah. I'm not sure what intuitionist means. If naturalist means like I think that somehow moral properties reduce to like pleasure and pain.
That's the naturalist view
Yeah,
then.
I'm not a naturalist. So I guess I would say I'm an anti-naturalist.
Okay, but there might be other branches of naturalism. I don't know for certain.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
But you're not a strict reductionist.
right.
Do you
So I
think?
think that, yeah, I think that um, there are genuine moral properties
Mhm.
in the world, and they don't reduce to non-moral properties.
Right.
So sometimes people think about, they call it the moral circle, like moral permissibility,
Yeah.
moral obligatoriness, and then being morally forbidden. And those terms can be interdefined. You know, you could pick any one as primitive and then define the other two. But the thought is people who talk about the moral circle, you can't define any of them outside of that circle. And I guess that's what I think too.
Yeah. Okay. The intuitionist would be the ones that think that we can only access moral facts by intuition. G. Moore famously defended this with his argument for the naturalist fallacy that becomes a
Mm-hmm.
tautology. When you say happiness is good, you not just mean happiness is happiness. So
Mm-hmm.
good cannot be reduced to happiness. So good is indefinable, simple, and abstract. And today we have, I don't know if you know Michael Hilmer, he's a philosopher
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
defends this position against the naturalists, but we also have very good naturalist views as well. Um, so maybe I think you would be more inclined to a non-reductionist naturalism than an intuitionism. You don't think it's just by intuition that we have access to permissibility or impermissibility.
I mean, I guess I think there's an epistemological question.
Yeah.
Like, how do we know that an act is morally right or morally wrong?
Yes.
And I guess I agree that we have to use an a priori faculty of intuitions.
Oh, okay.
But I
Surprise.
think it's similar with like aesthetic, trying to discern aesthetic facts, but also like mathematical facts,
Uh-huh.
philosophical facts, like any a priori discipline
Yeah.
is gonna the main evidence that is relevant is going to be a priori intuitions.
Yeah, that's true. And there were some philosophers on the 20th century who had a very strong prejudice against moral intuitions because there was this guy John Mackey had his argument from queerness. Moral intuitions are weird, so we have to discard with those. But what about epistemic intuitions? Are those not equally weird? Why are those not? And anyway, so
Yeah, so I would be more inclined to say moral intuitions are weird, and so good for them. Like that
yeah,
makes them especially interesting.
yeah, and as I told you, I also think space and time is weird. So what isn't weird to
Yeah.
begin with? And by the way, I forgot to ask you, why do you think space is necessary?
I think I do not have a great answer to that.
Okay.
So I guess I just think a possible world includes like a physical space, which may or may not have contents, and then a bunch of necessarily existing abstract non-physical things. But some of the abstract non-physical things like depend for their existence on the physical things, like the unit set of Mateus, which is an abstract thing. It doesn't have a location in space,
Yeah.
but it only exists when you exist.
Okay. Uh, so we are in a way talking about substance, what the ancient philosophers in a way understood as substance. Like, so don't you think maybe my substance could pre-exist my incarnation in space?
I think I do not believe that. Although I would need to know more about what your substance means. So like maybe it means like your essence.
Yeah, a form, a platonic form, something of the sort.
Yeah. I don't believe in platonic forms.
Okay.
So I think of platonic forms as like universals that are examples of themselves, like the platonic form of the horse.
Yeah.
It's not just the property of being a horse, it's literally a horse.
Yeah, right.
And for Plato, like what makes it the platonic form of the horse is that it is the horsiest horse possible,
Yeah.
an incredible horse. Same with the form of the dog and the man and the woman, etc. So I don't believe in those. I do believe in properties. Like I'm a an abundant theorist when it comes to properties, like all kinds of properties, including ones that are not instantiated. So including all the properties that you instantiate. Um, but I don't think I believe in a special essence property, like your essence, like a property that you instantiate and nothing else could instantiate. The closest would be there's the property of being identical to you. Um, and that's not a thing that exists necessarily. So that property, that's kind of like your singleton set. It's a thing that came into existence when you came into existence.
Right. Um, Properties to you are the same thing as universals.
Yeah.
Okay.
Except that universals include properties and also two-place universals like taller than, three-place universals like between, etc. And properties are like the one-place universals. It only takes one thing to have an instance of a property,
Yeah.
whereas it takes two things to have an instance of taller than. That's why it's a relation.
Mm-hmm. And maybe Plato was a little bit, who are we to say this, but maybe Plato was a little bit confused with the predicate attributing a, an ideal form, identifying it with the universal, right?
Yeah.
Because how could this ideal be self-predicating? You know, there would be a predicate above the ideal for him to have this property and another one and another one. So yeah, I think this is a good clarification of why there might not exist Platonic forms.
Yeah. Yeah, I like everything you just said, including the who are we to say, like against Plato. It does seem a little bit presumptuous, but still, that does seem like a real problem for Plato's theory of forms. I guess Plato and Aristotle talked about it a little bit. Sometimes it's called the problem of the third man.
Exactly, this is it. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
the Parmenides dialogue. Uh,
uh-huh,
it brings up this question.
yeah.
Um, so okay, so I think this is most of what I wanted to ask you about. To close, I noticed you are focusing a lot on the subject of time, and I would like to ask you then, is time real? Does it pass?
That's it?
That's it.
Yes. Oh, yes and yes. Yeah. So time is real, although I don't think time is a dimension in the same way that the dimensions of space are dimensions. So, for example, you can't stick time onto space and then get a unified manifold, as I discussed earlier. So I think time is it's like modality or morality in this sense. It's a dimension of reality. It's a part of reality, and it's a complicated, multifaceted dimension that involves several different concepts that are maybe interdefinable, interconnected, and some objective facts involving those concepts, like moral rightness and um, what was the other one I said? Morality, and I think
Modality.
modality. Yeah. So there are facts about what could be, what's necessary, and so that is a dimension of reality. So with time, it's sort of like it's not the dimension of what's possible; it's the dimension of change. Um, so it's like it's a way to talk about how you used to be younger, but now you're not that young anymore, and then in the future you will be even older, etc. So time is real, but it's a dimension of reality in a sort of a subtle, complicated way, unlike the dimensions of space, which are, form this unified manifold. And then does time pass? And I say yes, but for me, that just means, it has been the case that, like to quote Arthur Pryor, it has been 47 years since I am being born, and it is not now the case that it is 47 years since I am being born. In other words, I'm not as young as I used to be. So like time passes just means that things change.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
okay. I just thought about two challenging questions to not allow you to leave so soon. uh, but I promise this will be the last ones, okay? So,
okay.
first one about personal identity. What is the self in your view? We're doing philosophy 360.
Mhm. Um, yeah, great question. What is the self? So I am a materialist.
Oh, really?
I sort of don't want to be a materialist. I would love to believe in a soul.
Yeah.
And if I believed in a soul, then I would think that that is me. The thing that is identical to me is my soul. Happens to have a body right now, but that's only temporary. Um, so I would love to be convinced in the existence of souls. But for now, I don't believe that yet. So I think I'm just a physical object with the location in space. Um, and so, unlike many physical objects, I'm conscious. So some of us are conscious, some physical objects are conscious, and that's obviously an interesting phenomenon and famously hard question to explain why some physical things somehow have this subjective experience of consciousness. But it seems obvious that that is the case. We certainly know about our own subjective experience of consciousness, and I think it's a good inference that other people have that too.
Right.
So that's what I think is the self. It's just there's this conscious thing here, and that's me.
What about if you suffer an accident and got amnesia? Uh, I mean, what if you lose your conscious self in a way? You are dead, but you're still breathing. Your self is
Mhm.
dead. Do you think that?
Um, I mean, I think if I become brain dead,
Yeah.
but my body is still
Just
breathing,
like,
then that's a case where I still exist, but I lost some important properties. So I
okay.
lost the property of being conscious. I
Uh-huh.
lost the property of being a person.
Yeah.
So that physical body that's still there breathing, that's no longer a person. That is to say, it no longer has like the moral rights and responsibilities that go with being a person.
Understood.
Yeah.
Um, so even a dead person, in a way, it still exists because it just lost almost all of its properties. Like it's just
All the fun properties. Yeah.
only the
So
bone.
even a dead person, not just brain dead, but like dead, dead,
Yeah.
Um, I think in normal cases that the thing that was a person
Mhm.
and that died, that thing still exists. It's no longer alive. It's no longer a person. It's no longer conscious. It
Mhm.
lost most of the fun properties that it had, but it still exists. Until it gets cremated or until it decomposes, it still exists.
That's interesting because you're approaching the object as an object and not as a, the being of a person. The being a person, you're not saying this is an essential quality or property.
Exactly. Yeah.
This is
I
a
think being a person is a phase sortal. So it's an accidental property that you and I have temporarily. So I think, for example, there was a time when I existed and was alive, like when I was in utero, but I was not yet a person.
Mhm.
Because person is a moral concept that has to do with rights and responsibilities. It requires like consciousness and an ability to reason and deliberate, etc. Even when I was born, when I was like a 1 day old baby, I don't think I was a person, but that was me. I existed. I was once a 1 day old baby and was not a person.
Yeah,
And
but
maybe around the time of like, I don't know, age 4 or 6 or 7 or something, I came to be a person.
yeah, but what if someone, a thief, stole this baby and killed it, and then argued in court, oh, it's not a person.
They would still be guilty of many serious crimes because there are other ways to be like have moral value besides being a person.
Yeah, it would become a person soon. Yeah,
I mean, not just that it will become a person, it's
yeah,
already conscious. So, like,
yeah, right,
I don't know, a dog will never become a person, but it has moral value and you can't just steal it and torture it.
right. Okay. Um, the last question is the easiest question in philosophy. Okay, I think
Uh-oh.
you're gonna handle it with, I, I mean, um, no, it won't be a hard time at all. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready, but I'm very scared.
Okay, so why is there anything rather than nothing? Why being rather than nothing?
I think it's a contingent fact about the world. So basically, there's no explanation.
Okay.
Just luck.
Yeah, don't you think being is necessary?
Like physical being in physical space.
Yeah, you said space is necessary, but I mean all being, like all the abstract properties, it couldn't not
Ah.
be.
Oh yeah, good. I like that. I like what you're saying. I'll accept that as the answer to your question. So why is there something rather than nothing?
Yeah.
I misunderstood the question, but now I understand. And the answer is, well, there are many necessary things like numbers and properties. Um, and so they had to exist. It's necessary that they exist. And so therefore there has to be something, namely the necessarily existing things. I thought you were asking about like contingent things, like the contingent universe. Why is there it rather than nothing? And then I was saying the answer is just luck.
Yeah, that's plausible, very plausible. Um, and the necessary things couldn't be created, right?
Right. You can't create them because they automatically exist.
Yeah. Okay, this was a great talk. Thank you very much, Dr. Markosian. If you'd like to promote anything, now your time or to invite.
I'm I mean, if people were going to read one thing by me, I would like them to read that paper that I mentioned, Five New Arguments for the Dynamic Theory of Time. It's
Okay,
easy to find. If you Google me and go to my website, it's easy to find there.
yeah, I will put the website here in the description for everyone.
Uh,
Thanks everybody for watching, and
thank you, Mateus.
thank you. It was very nice. And so see you all next time.